Blenheim Palace, Oxfordshire. The wedding of the decade. 600 guests. A $75,000 morning suit. White orchids everywhere. 20 minutes before the ceremony, James Whitmore overhears his bride-to-be from the bridal suite, laughing with her bridesmaids. The words pierce through him. She'll keep seeing Marcus after the wedding. James is just the perfect husband for status. And children with the right bloodline. The fool suspects nothing. James looks at his reflection in the antique mirror. He could cancel everything, flee, break down. Instead, he takes his phone and sends a single message. Execute Plan B. He adjusts his cravat, walks out, composed. The wedding will proceed exactly as planned. But it won't be the wedding Victoria Blackwood expects. It will be the most spectacular revenge London has ever witnessed, broadcast live before 600 witnesses. James Whitmore stood before the gilded mirror in the groom's suite at Blenheim Palace, encased in £75,000 of Savile Row perfection, hand-stitched by Anderson and Shepherd's master tailors, who had worked for 3 months straight. The morning suit was a masterpiece of British tailoring. Vicuña wool so fine it felt like air. Mother-of-pearl buttons carved by hand. A waistcoat embroidered with his family crest in silver thread. Every detail represented the perfection he had always embodied. 32 years of impeccable breeding, naturally dark hair with that distinguished hint of early grey at the temples, Oxford first in PPE, Cambridge MBA, fluent in 4 languages, played polo at guards level. He was the sole heir to the Whitmore banking fortune, a family that counted 3 Lord Mayors of London, a Chancellor of the Exchequer under Churchill, 2 ambassadors to Washington, and a Georgian mansion in Belgravia that was worth more than most small countries' GDP. The money was intact, multiplied through generations of shrewd investment. But what he'd always lacked was the one thing money couldn't buy: true aristocratic lineage. And that's where the Blackwoods came in. Outside, in Blenheim's gardens transformed into an earthly paradise by Capability Brown 3 centuries ago, and now adorned with floral arrangements costing £200,000, 600 guests from British, European, and international high society waited. 8 months of preparation, £3 million budget, 5 wedding planners who'd been hired and fired, 200,000 white orchids flown in from Thailand, the London Symphony Orchestra, Michelin 3-star chefs, Dom Perignon, 1996, flowing like water. The press had been covering it for months. The Times had dedicated a special supplement. Tatler had the exclusive photography rights. Even the Wall Street Journal had sent a correspondent. The perfect union. The Blackwoods brought 800 years of history and a seat in the House of Lords. The Whitmores brought £800 million built over a century of banking genius and ruthless investment. Victoria Blackwood had conquered him with the precision of a military campaign. The first meeting 18 months ago at the American ambassador's residence during a charity gala for the National Gallery. She was 27, 5 feet 8 inches of legs that seemed genetically engineered, eyes the color of Cornish seas, a smile that had demolished half the eligible bachelors from London to Monaco. But she had chosen him. The courtship had been a strategic masterpiece. White roses every morning, never a dozen, always 18, her lucky number since boarding school. Spontaneous weekends, private jet landing at the family estate. Let's have lunch in Paris. Dinners on private rooftops overlooking the Thames with Tower Bridge, lit just for them. She knew the mayor personally. Gifts precisely calibrated. Not too ostentatious to seem nouveau riche. Not too modest to appear stingy. Graff for the 6 months. Garrard for her birthday. The Queen's own jeweler for the engagement. The proposal itself was pulled from a fairy tale. Westminster Bridge closed to traffic. 2,000 candles. The Kronos Quartet playing Elgar, her favorite composer, and him on one knee with a cashmere sapphire from Asprey worth £500,000, 12 carats surrounded by diamonds from the crown jeweler's private collection. Victoria, make me the happiest man alive. She had wept, said yes. Instagram had crashed. 2 million likes in 3 hours. His mother, Lady Margaret Whitmore, née Cavendish, therefore related to the Devonshires, had initially been thrilled. "Darling Victoria," she'd say, always with her full name, with that tone suggesting Victoria was exactly the sort of daughter-in-law one displayed at Ascot. The family solicitor had confirmed what everyone knew. The match would open every door that mere money couldn't unlock. The groom's suite was controlled chaos, orchestrated by Peregrine Ashworth, wedding planner to royalty, the man who'd organized weddings for Saudi princes, Hollywood A-listers, even minor European royals. A man of 60 who seemed perpetually on the verge of a coronary, always with 3 phones and a clipboard, barking orders in 5 languages at an army of terrified minions. The groomsmen were a collection of Britain's finest. His brother Oliver, 10 years younger, still at Eton, looking uncomfortable in formal wear. His cousins Charles and Henry, authentic aristocrats with that studied indifference of people who'd seen everything. And the requisite international element, Alessandro, son of an Italian count, providing that continental sophistication. The photographer was Mario Testino himself, £50,000 for the day. But these photos would end up in Vanity Fair. The barber was the king's own. The valet had dressed 3 prime ministers. Every detail had been considered to create absolute perfection. James needed a moment of solitude. The anxiety he'd attributed to normal pre-wedding nerves was becoming oppressive. He retreated to the adjacent library, a space of 200 square meters filled with first editions, leather-bound volumes that smelled of centuries, and portraits of Marlboroughs staring down with aristocratic disdain. He sat in a wing-back chair that had probably seated Churchill, closed his eyes, attempted to breathe. In 20 minutes, he would walk down that aisle, say, "I do," become Lord Blackwood by marriage. Victoria's father had no sons. The title could pass through the female line with the right legal maneuvering. He would complete his family's centuries-long ascent from merchants to nobility. It was what he wanted, wasn't it? It was what he'd been groomed for since Harrow. It was in this moment of silence that the voices came clearly through the French doors. The library had doors opening onto a stone balcony, and this connected to the main terrace where the bridal suite opened out. The door was ajar. Someone had probably opened it for air. He recognized Victoria's voice immediately. That cut-glass accent that could slice through steel, now accompanied by laughter he'd never heard from her. Harder, more genuine. There were others, too. Clarissa, the maid of honor, her best friend since Cheltenham Ladies' College. Arabella, the cousin who ran a gallery in Mayfair. Tamara, Fenella, and Jemima, the rest of the set, as they called themselves, all daughters of peers playing at having careers with daddy's money. They were drinking champagne. He could hear the distinctive pop and fizz, probably the Krug Clos du Mesnil 1995 that Victoria had insisted on. £2,000 a bottle from the palace's private cellar. They were laughing, gossiping. He heard the rustle of silk, probably final adjustments to the dress. The conversation started innocently enough. Compliments on the flowers, jokes about James's nervousness, predictions about how many tissues his mother would need during the vows. But then the tone shifted, slipped into that territory women explore when they believe themselves safe from male ears. It was Arabella who started with her knowing tone. Victoria explained calmly how she would manage the marriage. James was perfect for the husband role. Handsome, wealthy, well-connected, he'd give her children with the right genetic lottery ticket. But Marcus, that name hit James like a cricket bat to the skull. Marcus remained Marcus. 3 years of parallel passion she had no intention of ending. She'd even convinced James to buy the Notting Hill townhouse, supposedly for her charity work. actually for afternoon liaisons. The laughter that followed was like broken glass. But the sharpest shard came when Clarissa asked if James suspected anything. Victoria's response was casually cruel beyond anything James could have imagined. He was so desperately in love, so eager to prove himself worthy of her bloodline, that he wouldn't see the truth if she painted it on his forehead. "The fool suspects nothing." Those exact words, delivered with amused contempt. The details accumulated like evidence in court. Marcus Rothschild, art dealer with galleries in Mayfair and New York, tall, dark Byronic type who wore his shirts a bit too open to be respectable. The spa weekends in Bath that were actually in his Cotswolds estate. The £5,000 monthly allowance she'd convinced James was for her charity, but went straight to funding their love nest. The contempt for James's desperation to be accepted by real aristocracy, despite his billions. "It's the perfect arrangement," Victoria concluded. "The banker at home for respectability and breeding, the lover in bed for actual pleasure. Separate property agreements naturally. I'm not stupid. The Whitmores get their entree into proper society. I get to maintain the Blackwood estates, and have my cake too. Win-win." The clink of glasses toasting was the last thing James heard before the voices moved away. He sat frozen for 5 long minutes, processing what he'd just heard. Every word was a puzzle piece, completing a picture he'd refused to see. He rose slowly and looked at his reflection in the library's antique mirror. His reflection still showed the perfect groom, but his eyes were different. No longer those of a man in love, but of someone who'd just seen behind the veil of the world. He pulled out his phone from the Hermes pocket square holder, Victoria's gift for the stag party. He opened WhatsApp and found the contact saved as Plan B. Sebastian, his university roommate, 35 years old, now a forensic accountant who specialized in high-stakes divorces, the only one who'd always harbored doubts about Victoria. The message was brief but decisive. Sebastian's response arrived instantly, confirming everything was ready. James replaced the phone, adjusted his morning coat, straightened his ancestral cufflinks. When he opened the library door, his smile was the most genuine he'd ever worn.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
And the most dangerous. The boy desperate for acceptance had died in that library. In his place stood a man who would give London the show of the century. The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in emotional control. James moved among the groomsmen and photographers, as always, perfect in his role of nervous but happy groom, while his mind orchestrated the systematic destruction of Victoria Blackwood. Sebastian's Plan B, prepared out of professional paranoia, would prove providential. He thought back now on 18 months of ignored signals with new eyes, the unexplained absences, the calls taken privately, the men's cologne on her coat. Marcus, now the ghost, had a name and a face. That art dealer whose gallery openings Victoria never missed, whom she always described as terribly talented and so devoted to his work. His mother, Lady Margaret, entered the suite in powder blue Chanel haute couture that cost more than most London flats. The banking heiress had invested everything in this wedding, not just financially, but socially. The Whitmore ascension to true aristocracy depended on this union. Lord Blackwood waited in the anteroom, immaculate in morning dress that had served 4 generations of family weddings. 70 years old, 8 centuries of family history on his shoulders, and estates that required Victoria's inheritance to maintain. When James shook his hand, the older man's confusion at James's strange smile would soon make terrible sense. The wedding march began. The great doors opened onto the gardens where 600 people rose to their feet. James saw everything as if through glass. The Blackwoods in the front row already savoring their financial salvation, the cameras that had paid fortunes for exclusivity, and Victoria approaching from the palace, statuesque in her McQueen gown. With that smile that now seemed like a sneer of triumph, she glided down the aisle. 100 steps, he counted one by one. The afternoon sun created a dreamlike atmosphere between the ancient oaks planted by Queen Anne. Victoria took his hand when she reached the altar, whispering that he looked magnificent. He replied that she did too, and wasn't lying. She was magnificent in her deception. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself, a family friend, began the ceremony in his ancient voice. James waited for the right moment, the one Sebastian had indicated, the exchange of rings, the moment of maximum attention when nobody could ignore what was about to happen. Victoria slipped the ring on his finger while reciting her vows in a clear voice, promising eternal love with the same mouth that had planned betrayal 20 minutes earlier. When his turn came, James took the ring, looked Victoria in the eyes, and instead of reciting his vows, spoke in a voice that the sound system carried to every corner of the garden. He revealed that he'd heard everything. The affair with Marcus, the plans to continue it, the contempt with which she spoke of him. The silence that followed was absolute, cinematic. Victoria's face went through a spectrum of colors and expressions, while James continued, relentless. He didn't stop at words. He pulled out his phone and played the recording. Victoria's voice filled the garden through the audio system Sebastian had hacked. Every word, every laugh, every insult amplified for 600 witnesses. Lady Blackwood fainted into her chair. Lord Blackwood rose, shouting legal threats. The guests were paralyzed between shock and morbid curiosity about how this would end. The show had only just begun. With theatrical precision, James invited Marcus Rothschild to join them at the altar. The man emerged from the crowd. He'd come to the wedding, the lover witnessing his rival's supposed triumph, dressed in a burgundy velvet jacket, inappropriate for a wedding, but perfect for a public execution. James had orchestrated everything with surgical precision. The revelations came like hammer blows. The giant screen that should have shown romantic couple photos now displayed screenshots of messages, compromising photographs, bank statements. 3 years of affair documented meticulously. £600,000 spent on the lover, gifts that exceeded anything given to the official fiancé by 20-fold. The coup de grace was the contract showing Victoria had transferred the Notting Hill property to Marcus's name, essentially paying him like a gigolo. Marcus's signature was forged, another crime for the list. Lord Blackwood attempted to intervene to salvage the situation, but James had prepared a surprise for him too. Documents showing estate fraud, systematic tax evasion through offshore accounts, art smuggling using diplomatic immunity. As he spoke, the sirens of the Serious Fraud Office approached. Perfect timing, another detail orchestrated by Sebastian. Victoria attempted one last pathetic defense, accusing James of destroying everything out of wounded pride. He laughed, a real laugh, liberating, and explained he'd destroyed nothing, merely made public what she did in private. He removed the £500,000 ring and let it fall at her feet with a clink that echoed in the silence. The flight from Blenheim was chaotic. Guests fled as if from a burning building, terrified of association with scandal. The Blackwoods were led away in handcuffs. Marcus screamed hysterical threats. The media were in ecstasy over the scoop of the century. James remained standing at the altar, statuesque in his mourning suit, observing the destruction with the calm of a victorious general. His mother approached and, surprisingly, instead of scolding, embraced him with pride. A Whitmore had defended the family honor. Grandfather the war hero would have been proud. 6 months later, James's office commanded a spectacular view over the city of London. Phoenix Capital, the fund established with Sebastian, was already the most sought-after name in London for forensic financial investigation and asset protection. The Whitmore-Blackwood affair had entered legend, studied at law schools as an example of perfect legal execution of revenge. Victoria was under house arrest, awaiting trial that promised years in prison. Her father, Lord Blackwood, was already imprisoned. The investigation had uncovered criminal ramifications far beyond tax evasion. Marcus had fled to Switzerland, his galleries seized by creditors. James had become an inadvertent icon. Men stopped him in the street to thank him, share their stories. He'd received multi-million offers for books, films, Netflix series. He'd refused them all, for now. The call came on an ordinary afternoon. Oliver informed him Victoria had attempted suicide and was hospitalized at St. Thomas's. She'd left a letter for him, mentioning 30 million hidden in Cayman accounts she'd surrender for one last meeting. St. Thomas's Hospital smelled of disinfectant and failure. In the psychiatric ward, Victoria Blackwood was unrecognizable. 6 months had transformed the goddess into a specter, hair gray at the roots, face gaunt, the empty stare of someone who'd lost everything. The conversation was brief and brutal. Victoria handed over the Cayman documents, authentic, verified by lawyers. She confessed to losing everything. Her father had disowned her from prison. Her mother had fled to Monte Carlo pretending she didn't exist. Friends had evaporated. Marcus had stolen her remaining jewelry before disappearing with a Russian oligarch's wife. She admitted, with useless late clarity, that James had been right. She'd been an arrogant woman convinced she could have everything. She even confessed, supreme irony, only understanding she'd actually loved him once he'd destroyed her. James felt no pity. He told her coldly she could have simply loved him instead of betraying him. He took the documents and, before leaving, left her one last poisoned gift. Next time she attempted suicide, she should do a better job. 1 year after the aborted wedding, James Whitmore was another person. Or rather, he'd become who he'd always been beneath the surface of the perfect groom, desperate for acceptance. Phoenix Capital managed billions, had offices in London, Edinburgh, and Dublin, employed 200 people, half of them women who'd been betrayed and rebuilt. The Blackwood trial had produced heavy sentences. Victoria got 6 years, her father 12. The ancestral estates were auctioned to pay debts. The Whitmores had not only recovered, but ascended. James was seen as the hero who'd exposed aristocratic corruption. On that spring morning, exactly 1 year later, James returned to Blenheim Palace. The venue was booked for another wedding, another couple, other dreams. He stood at the exact spot where he should have said, "I do," and smiled. The revenge was complete. That wasn't the real triumph. The victory was in transformation. The boy, desperate for acceptance, had died at that altar. But from his ashes rose a man who wrote his own rules. The phone rang, another client, another betrayal to investigate, another person to protect. James answered in a professional voice, already focused on the next case. Walking back to his Aston Martin, bought with the first profits, a small personal reward, he passed a wedding couple posing for photos. The groom recognized him, eyes widening. James winked and whispered a single word: investigate. The boy, desperate for acceptance, was dead, but the king of reality was more alive than ever. And as London gleamed in the spring sunshine, James Whitmore drove toward the future he'd conquered with his own hands, paid for with his own pain, and sealed with the most spectacular revenge. He didn't need aristocratic validation. He'd become his own empire. Did this story shock you? Leave a like and subscribe. Comment, what would you have done in James's place? Share with those who need to know that revenge is a dish best served cold. Next video, he discovered the betrayal on the honeymoon. What he did next went viral.